What inspired you to focus on inclusion and diversity and culture in your professional work? Where did that drive come from?
I think looking back, I'd always been.
What would be your advice to give to a leader to how to lead across the generations? Maybe that's a good place to start.
I think the first thing for any leader in any real situation is.
What do you believe is the most common misconceptions about diversity and inclusion?
I think for me there's two, particularly at the moment in the.
Welcome to episode 10 of The Life of a Business Leader. I'm delighted today to be joined by Claire Harvey, MBE. Claire, thank you for coming on to The Life of a Business Leader. It's great to have you on the session today.
It's very exciting. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited about our subject matter that we're going to be talking about today. The intriguing title, Powering Performance, the role of diversity, inclusion, and cultural empowerment. So this is going to be a great subject matter. Claire, what I thought would be useful is I think it's really important that people get a frame for your background, because I think that will help then when we start delving into the subject matter. So I have stolen a couple of things off your bio that I just want to kind of play off, which were the highlights that I drew out. So number one, a world leader in diversity and culture and also a Paralympian, PhD in psychology, recognized for your work and expertise in change management and leadership behaviors aligns to impactful organizational change and design. You've worked in both the public and the private sector, prison governor. You worked at the FSA, UK financial regulator, as head of corporate responsibility and culture. Other big organisations you've worked with include KPMG, Disney, Vodafone. And what's also fascinating is your sporting achievements. You played rugby union at the highest level. You captained the first ever Paralympics GB women's sitting volleyball team. You were Athletics World Championships seated throws events, the first ever GB Para Ice Hockey squad as the goalkeeper, and in 2017 for your contribution to sport and inclusion, you were recognised with an MBE deserved reward. So my first question for you is, wow, when do you get the time to do all of that?
It's I don't like resting. And actually one of the biggest challenges in my sporting world was learning the power of resting and recharging rather than being constantly busy. But I think if you love what you do and you love challenge and you want to really excel in things, and I'm deeply competitive by nature, then you just find time. And actually it's more the people around me who facilitate me finding that time. Like when in the Paralympics, for example, people always said to me, all the sacrifices you must have made. And I was like, I haven't made any sacrifices. I go and play sport all day and I love it. You know, that's no sacrifice. It's my family, my partner, the people around me who make the sacrifices so that I can free up that time. So I think it's like anything. If you want it to happen, then you find a way of doing it.
And you make it happen. And I think also what would be great for the listener is just to understand how you and I met. We were both speaking at DIN the other week, Disruptive Innovators Network. And I was so drawn to your session, and it dovetailed so well with what I delivered about why it's thinking like a day one business. It was almost like we'd met before and we're prepared. So I think there are kindred spirits in terms of our alignment, in terms of thinking with organizational and people development. I guess what a great question to start with would be, what inspired you to focus on inclusion and diversity and culture in your professional work? Where did that drive come from?
I think looking back, I'd always been very people orientated. I fell into the prison service without much of an idea really what I wanted to do. I went to university based on how far away could I get from home, as opposed to a love of a subject. And thankfully I found psychology and sociology and absolutely loved them. But I think particularly nowadays, when you look at young people and the pressure for them really quickly to identify what is it you want to do, and you've got to pay to go to university, and you've got to have that plan. I think that's really sad, because in my case, I had zero plan, and I'm not even sure I do now, quite frankly. But I just, taking each step at a time kind of opened wider doors, and I think we've lost some of that. But I think definitely working in the prison service, what it taught me was a huge amount about people, and how in the right environment, people can do extraordinary things, and in the wrong environment, people can do things that you never imagined possible. And
Yeah.
when you look at people's a lot of the people that I worked with in terms of prisoners, when you looked at their history, you could see what was coming a mile off, and the system had kind of failed them on many, many occasions. And that doesn't take away, their individual choice making, but it really brought home to me the power of that environment, alongside and it working in an environment where, frankly, I'm 5'5" and built like a piece of wet string, and I was routinely on landings in environments with 100 prisoners. If they'd wanted to riot, they would have rioted every single day of the week. I was not going to stop them doing that, which again highlights the power of relationships, culture, environment to shape behavior. And then when I came into the corporate world and, was looking at the financial crisis and the things that had led to the financial crisis, again, it really highlighted to me, we get what we put energy into, we get what we reward. And if you're not really conscious about the environment you create and how you enable everybody to feel part of that, and that they are accountable for that, and that they're helping shape that, you end up unintentionally sometimes creating the wrong behaviors, and it's much harder to unpick than it is to really shape in the first place.
Wow. And this subject for me is it almost could feel like an elephant. And one of the things that I really focus on the Life of a Business Leader podcast is how do we make this really practical? How do we make it real so that leaders listening to us talking today can take away practical ideas that they'll be able to implement to build better businesses, to be better leaders? So just as a soft landing in terms of an opening question, it's possible today that in business, you could have 5 different generations that are working in your business, all with different motivations, drivers, wants, needs. What would be your advice to give to a leader to how to lead across the generations? Maybe that's a good place for us to start.
I think the first thing for any leader in any real situation is stop and reflect on your own stuff first. Because what we tend to do without realizing it is we put our own view of the world, our own way of what we think is right and wrong, our own preference of how things are done into how things are done around here, often really unintentionally, either because we're shaping things or because of the dynamics of the culture. People are always thinking about, what would my boss like? What would my boss like? And that means whatever people see you do gets kind of hardwired into the culture, and it can be really unintentional. And what we often see, particularly in the intergenerational space, is that there's a real mismatch between leaders who tend to be at one end of the generational sphere and people coming into the business who tend to be at the other generational sphere. Of course, not always, but people create the culture based on what they're comfortable with. And rather than sitting with that discomfort of, that doesn't work for me, or I don't like that, or, I believe, particularly in the inclusion space, what we often see is these are things that should be talked about at home, and these are things that should be talked about at work, and almost the two don't mix. Whereas actually we know the younger generations coming in don't see it like that, because that's not their experience, because of how the world has shaped their view. And so leaders often make decisions based on their level of comfort and their level of understanding, as opposed to thinking about who is it that this decision is being made for, and thinking very differently. So my top piece of guidance is, firstly, reflect on yourself,
Yeah.
and understand those drivers, and then just try and catch yourself every now and again. But secondly, don't see different approaches as less than. So I hear all of the time, oh, that the younger generation, they're so entitled, they've been here 5 minutes and they suddenly want this, that and the other, or heaven forbid, they're not prepared to work after hours, or without a conversation about pay. And I kind of always joke and go, listen to that sentence, who is the idiot in this conversation?
Yeah.
But it's not right nor wrong. Neither side is right nor wrong. And I think in corporate culture, we've very much developed a right and wrong approach. They're just different. And so we've got to see them as different and build that thinking into the culture, rather than try and go one way or the other.
So two questions are based on what you've just shared there. Question one would be, do you think that leaders find it easier to lead if they are leading somebody within their generational age who have probably come up on a journey through life similar to them? Do you find that in terms of your work, that they find it easier in their range zone of their own generation?
I think every person is different, but I think as a general rule, whether it's generational, whether it's other any other form of difference, human nature is we like people like us. If somebody's like us, if they have a shared understanding of the world, if they have a shared way of doing things, if they have a shared sphere of reference, they're easier to work with, because working in a diverse environment, whatever that diversity is hard work. It brings better dividends, in the same way that working with the client group that you've already got and that already love you is super easy work. Trying to engage the clients that you don't currently have and that don't like you as a brand is much harder work. It brings better dividends, and it's exactly the same in the culture space.
And second question that feeds out of that, do you think, in your experience of organizations and leaders that you work with, the leaders have invested enough time in understanding those 5 different generations and the different modalities and motivations? Because even if they, in my mind, had a deeper understanding of what some of those different drivers, motivations, preferences in communication, and I'm thinking very much to some of the slides that you shared at the DIN conference, which were just, really simple slides, but started to hone in on some of those preferences. In your experience, do you think leaders have spent enough time understanding? Because a baseline of understanding then allows you to think further about application.
Yeah, no, in a word, no. And that's not because they're bad people. It's because the corporate culture isn't mainly set up like that. It's a problem solution culture. You wait till there's a problem. And I would always argue problems that come down the line are big problems now that were small problems 3 or 4 years ago that you didn't think were important enough to look at. So we don't have an early problem indicator system in most cultures. And then so we wait till there's a problem, and then we look for the solution. And by nature of looking for the solution in a time poor, ever changing, ever complex business, you look for the easiest, simplest solution that is tactical, that you can manage, which means we never stop, or we don't never, but we very rarely stop and look at the root cause of the problem. And so all we're doing is sticking plasters on. And it's not just about intergenerational. You see it within cultures, right? Even within, like, if you think about complex organizations, do finance ever stop to think about what's this experience like from a different part of the business, from risk? Do risk ever think about, when I come and do X, Y, and Z, how does that fit in with the experience of another part of the business? We are hardwired, because it's easier and simple, and our brains like simplicity, to live within our own little, micro culture. And we don't get rewarded. And in the world of business, people get rewarded for, people do what they get rewarded for. And so unless we reward that kind of time and reward that kind of thinking, it's an optional extra, which means those who are already motivated by it do it, but other people don't.
So maybe 2 actions that for our listeners that they can internalize and take away. Number 1, reflect on your own preferences in terms of your motivations and drivers, but recognize that lead people as they like to be led, not how you like to be led. And that might be you've got to live at the edge of your comfort zone in order to understand how other people are wired and recognize there's no right or wrong. We're just across the generations, we're just wired differently. Is that fair kind of summary of an action that people could do?
Yeah, absolutely. And be intentional in your leadership style to achieve what it is you're intentionally trying to achieve.
Nice. I love that word, intentional or purposeful. Is be conscious and deliberate is what you're saying. What I'm hearing you say is be conscious and deliberate about understanding your impact on others and their preferences in terms of how they like to be led. And the second action most definitely is there is so much out there in terms of go to Google and type in different generations and you'll get some great little models that will give you insight. Just developing a deeper understanding of preferences, motivations, drivers, communication preferences. That understanding will then help to equip you to be better as a leader about how you engage across the different generations. And as I say, I know you had some brilliant slides that you shared at DIN, which just really succinctly articulated those key differences.
Yeah, and they're a starting point, right? That none of this is exact science. It's a starting point. That most of the research, I think, as I said at DIN, most of the research is very white Western men orientated. And so within any environment, you'll find people who don't quite fit into those, but it's a really good starting point to get you thinking. And then you can put the lens of, what does this look like in my environment? What does this look like in my area? And then start developing your thinking.
And Claire, in all the work that you do, what do you believe is the most common misconceptions about diversity and inclusion? Yeah, that's probably a point. People always say I love to put the questions out there and put you on the spot, and just so people know that when we do the Life of a Business Leader, these questions are not prepped. Claire's not seen these. We just do it cold, raw, because I think that's when we get the best conversations.
I think for me, there's 2, particularly at the moment in the, increasingly polarized or perceptions of polarized, because I don't actually think it's as polarized as we would be led to believe. But, in this kind of current geopolitics space, I think the first perception is that inclusion is like a pie, and therefore, in order to give equity to one group, we have to take something away from another group. And that just simply isn't true. And unfortunately, what I would say about this space is, like with any space, there are people with varying degrees of proficiency and knowledge and understanding who are operating in this space. And so many organizations have been kind of attracted to what sounds like a super simple, just do these events, just do this program, and that's it, job done. These are complex problems. So complex problems don't get solved by simple solutions. So if it feels simple, it's not actually going to solve your problem. But people, again, are looking for that quick problem solution answer. And there are some, but they're about embedding stuff into how you do things as opposed to an add-on activity. So that's the first thing I would say. The first major barrier that we have to get past is giving inclusion to any group requires other people to lose something, and it simply isn't true if it's done well. The only people who are, if you take gender, for example, very live conversation, the gender pay gap isn't really moving the dial. The only people who are at risk from building gender equity and parity into our and mitigating bias in our systems are those people who've got where they've got to by not skill, not ability, but networks and privilege and, maintaining the underrepresentation of women. So unless we're particularly worried about that group, which most of us would say we wouldn't want in our positions of power anyway, then we really don't have anything to worry about. The second thing I would say is around, this is an extra thing that we should do. And again, that's why often we find it hard to gain traction in organizations, because people want to manage diversity. They want to wait until they've got different types of people, or there's a problem in a situation, and then they want to manage that situation. Whereas actually, if you practice inclusion, if you embed inclusive thinking, inclusive behavior into the way that you do things before you're aware that there are people with different needs and different barriers in whatever group it is you're talking about, then it isn't extra. It's doing what you normally do, but with a slightly different lens.
Yeah, got it. Another question for you. In your experience, is there a direct correlation between your diversity and inclusion and the organizational performance and innovation? Are the two inextricably linked?
So it's a really interesting question and a very live question at the moment, because lots of very, very clever people produce lots of research that will tell you it is. And, I think with the volume of research it would be foolish, I think, to say, no, that's completely untrue. Of course, what we don't have is a causal link, because short of taking two identical organizations, starting them from scratch and running one inclusively and one not inclusively, how are you ever going to know what's the driver of what? But what we do know is that diverse teams in an inclusive environment, when you look at their outcomes, they perform better. And they perform better on lots of different scenarios, but particularly around better decision making, less ethical breaches, and kind of innovation and those kind of things. And there's logic for that, right? If you've got people who all think the same, it's very hard to think outside of that. Whereas if you've got people with all different perspectives, you're going to have many more ideas, but you've got to have the culture where people are going to listen to those ideas, run with those ideas, build on those ideas, rather than play the tokenistic view of you're in the room, but no one's actually paying you any attention. So there is a link. It's not, we don't know it's a pure correlation. We don't know it's causal. Is it to do with it's easier to create diverse teams in certain sectors? Who knows? But we know that it definitely doesn't harm organizations, that's for sure.
Yeah, and common sense says, doesn't it, that if you've got cognitive and cultural diversity in the room and you haven't got a team of people who think the same way as you, then you're going to come up with better solutions to problems. You're going to be more creative. You're going to be more innovative. You're going to debate for the right answer. I mean, you don't need the stats to be able to demonstrate that on paper. That makes common sense. But a question for you, how do leaders overcome the barrier of, number one, recruiting in their shadow and recruiting like-minded people? And how can they be bold and courageous about recruiting the diverse cultures, recruiting for cognitive diversity? Because is it not something about comfort zone, depending on your leadership style and whether you're command and control or whether you are an empowered leader? So from an individual leadership perspective, what do you see in organizations that you work with in terms of the challenges there?
So I think, again, it goes back to intentional. And the trouble is, most of us, you can't be intentional about absolutely everything. We don't have the time. Our brains are not hardwired that way. And in most organizations, we don't have time for clunky, slow and uncomfortable, which is what intentional thinking is. So we have to pick the moments that we want to be intentional because it matters, and we don't often think about further down the river. There's that great saying, isn't there, about rather than picking people out, and we tend to use it in the mental health space and the kind of addiction space. Rather than picking people out the river at the bridge, we need to go further upstream and work out why people are falling in the first place. And the same is true, I think, of organizations. Rather than looking at your shortlist or your interviews and going, what have I got? You need to go back further up and go, what was the job description? Did I actually spend time thinking about what I need in this role? What's potential versus experience? What is the gap I'm trying to fill, rather than the cookie cutter? I need exactly what I've just lost, and how quickly can I get it? Because all of those things we add on shorten your pool, and most sectors actually fish from a very small pool, particularly the more higher up you go into an organization. So thinking about all of those processes, and then having data, having somebody or some system in your organization that looks at the outcome, because the best prediction of future behavior is past behavior. And when we make those individual decisions, our brains are great at thinking we are making the best decision possible, because our brains talk us into what we wanted to do in the first place, which is why most of us in our personal lives are particularly bad at making good decisions. And we all do things that we know we shouldn't actually do, but our brains are great at kind of moving us in that direction. So in organizations, we have to go back. And what I see works well is systems and structures, guardrails, not huge amounts of bureaucracy, because again, we don't have time for that. It's never going to work. But picking the moments that matter in your teams, in your environments, whether it's a job description, whether it's the interview process, whether it's a sifting, and actually being really intentional about building inclusion into those. So a really great example where we're seeing a lot of traction is giving people questions up front in interviews. It's great for people with neurodivergence. It's great for more reflective thinkers. It's great for people who just like to be prepared, and for busy people who are going to just work through that in a better way. It's great for lots of people. And people often go, oh my God, can't do that. It's giving people an unfair advantage or whatever. But if you do it for everyone, if you actually think about it, how many people, how many roles in our organizations do we want people to just answer questions on the fly, to not have any groundwork, any preparation, do any research, and just sit in a room and answer questions, a bit like we're doing? But in most organizations, that isn't what you want someone to do in a job. So therefore, putting that process in the interview scheme actually isn't measuring anything that's real life. And what you get is people who are super able to wing it, super confident. And what you miss is the people who might not have those skills, but want to be super prepared and have good deep knowledge and know how to research and know how to prepare an answer. And they're the people that are probably going to be more successful in your job. So it's really thinking about those things further upstream.
It's a really interesting take, that, Claire, because I would imagine our listener might be thinking, okay, that sounds great, but am I going to get somebody who's just going to put the questions into ChatGPT, speak to their friends, get answers that they think the interviewer is going to want to hear? But I guess you could get the best of both worlds, couldn't you? Because you could give them a set of questions to prep, to really absolutely pick up those people who are more reflective, like you say. But you could also still have half a dozen questions that you throw out in the interview to find how well people deal on their feet and are reflect or can answer questions in the zone. So you could still get the best of both worlds, couldn't you?
Yeah, and you can do things that, again, I would always say, look at what the person needs to do in the job to be successful and replicate that in the interview process. So you could ask someone to do a presentation, as well as the questions that you're going to be prepared, and then actually ask them questions about that presentation. So there's lots of things you can do based on the specifics of the job, but the more we put in barriers, the less likely we are to get difference in our outcomes.
And you're taking me down a pathway where exactly I wanted to go, Claire, because if you're a Vodafone or you're a KPMG and you can afford to have a dedicated individual who looks at your diversity and inclusion, and you can bring in a real specialist with a psychology degree and so forth, that's great for big organizations. But a lot of our listeners for the Life of a Business Leader podcast will be, SME, owner-managed businesses where they can't afford those resources. So making it really practical, how does an SME business make sure that they don't just fall into, I've got a tick box because I've got a policy about inclusion and diversity. Where you're leading, the title for the podcast was The Role of Diversity, Inclusion and Cultural Empowerment. How do you make sure this is innately baked into your culture, where it's not a tick box, where it does become part of your DNA, but without it becoming cumbersome, recognizing that as a business owner, you are spinning thousands of plates and can't necessarily have a load of resources you can dedicate to this. So I think that'd be really useful, getting your spin on that.
So I think the first thing you can do is look at what your current culture is. And there's super simple ways of doing that. Look at who's being successful and who's not. Go back and see, depending on the size of your business, who have I recruited in the last 2 years? Who didn't get through? Who did I recruit that didn't survive very well? That probation period is a really good test of your culture. People often think people who are new to the organization don't have a lot to tell us about our culture, and people who've been here a long time do. It's often the other way around, particularly in smaller startup type businesses, because you're shaping the culture, and it's a bit like swimming in the pond, right? The longer you've been in the pond, the more you don't see the culture. Whereas when you're new, you absolutely can tell really quickly, because we're hardwired to fit. So we're constantly looking for what matters here, what doesn't matter here, what's the unspoken rules here that I'm picking up, and we're very conscious about them, whereas later on we kind of just build them into our behaviors. So spend some time just looking who's being successful, who's not, who are we listening to here, who are we not, how are we doing things like meetings. Like, I'm a super quick thinker, and I get bored quite quickly. So I know, left to my own devices, if I'm organizing a meeting, I'm going to be like, right, here's the problem. We need 20 minutes. Let's brainstorm ideas. Let's get to the table. We're going to leave this room with a solution. It works really well for me. But if I also know there are people in my team who are really, really reflective thinkers, by doing that in a way that works for me, what I'm doing is I'm missing out on all of their brilliance and actually probably making them feel really disengaged. So looking at how you do things, what are the unspoken rules of the culture, and working out, do they want to help? Are they helping us, or are they hindering us? I'll give you a really good example. I used to work with the fire brigade, and we were looking at ways of breaking down the hierarchy to build more psychological safety. Because what we found was people who could see problems, who could see better ways of doing things, weren't telling people higher up because of the power dynamic in the hierarchy. So the aim was to break the hierarchy down. When I spent a day in this particular fire service, one of the things we found was there's different color shirts that people wear. Some people wear blue shirts, some people wear white shirts. And because I'm curious, I was asking, well, why is that? And they were like, oh, well, once you get to this rank, you have to wear a white shirt, because you can't go out to businesses and external meetings in a blue shirt. Well, I don't have a poker face, so I think my body language probably gave away what I was thinking. But that made them stop and go, do you know what, that probably isn't very helpful anymore. So we often have things in our culture that have just developed, and they were probably right in a time and in a moment. But unless we actively look at our culture and go, what are those unspoken rules? Are they helping us where we are now, or are they hindering us now? And actively move those things in the right direction, then we can unintentionally sleepwalk into a very comfortable culture.
And do you think businesses, especially early stage businesses, invest enough time early on really thinking about the culture that they have, but also the to-be culture that they want? In your experience, do they put enough time in early on, or is that a failing where businesses fall back on?
I think they don't. Not because they don't want to, but I think two things happen. One is you get very caught into the doing very, very quickly. Again, as humans, we're hardwired to do because we often get rewarded for doing. You think about any organization that you've worked with or that you're in, how are the people who perhaps do a lot of thinking but not doing? How many roles do you have where there's thinking time? How much do we see that as a luxury rather than, we measure people's success? How many people walk around and talk about? I would say nowadays kind of busy has become the new badge of honor. People talk about how busy they are all the time because that's what we reward. And so I think people get very quick into doing. The second thing is it's very hard to do when you're a new business because you haven't really developed, you haven't got the teams and structure. But actually, all of the research, if you look at, there was a project called Project Aristotle that looked at Google as an organization and looked at what drives high performance in the teams within Google. They looked at all the different variables from skill set, size, budget, allocation, all of the things that we often think about when we are setting up teams and we're scaling up a business. And what they found was by far the biggest driver of performance was none of those things. It was how a team worked together.
Yeah.
But I would argue we don't think about that. And even we don't think about that as new teams. We just think about getting people into a room. But we also don't think about that as existing teams. When we bring new people into a team, we don't redesign how we're going to work together. What we often do is say, let me show you how we do things around here. So we're taking brilliant people who've got new ideas, new perspectives, and we're shoving them into a fit, which means because people want to fit and they want to do well, they lose all that stuff that made them different in order to feel like they fit. So actually, we've got really easy tools to do, but we just need to hold that desire to get going and spend some more time being intentional and thinking.
And that was an absolute loaded question that I threw to you because in my experience, definitely from what I've done over 2 decades and it's borne out in the research when you look at when LinkedIn was created, Howard Schultz at Starbucks, all the feedback from those leaders who have built those organizations was, I wish we'd spent more time in the formative years about defining the culture and what we stood for as an organization, because we probably wouldn't have burnt through as many people or hired the wrong people or made so many mistakes. So I think for anybody listening to this, how much time have you invested in, you're not going to get it perfect. It will be work in progress. But really starting to think about consciously, and I go back to your word of intentionally thinking about the culture, the to-be culture that you want in your organization so that you can recruit the right people into that environment.
I think also what measures a good culture, and I think often there's a lack of understanding in that space. People say, if I had £1 for every time I've worked with an organization who told me we're like a family, and that for me is a massive red flag. My normal answer to that is, show me one family where when you scrape the surface, there isn't a whole level of dysfunction going on. But also, work isn't a family. We don't, you don't sack your family members. Work is adult relationships, adult to adult, boundaried, professional relationships. So often we measure the wrong things. A really good high performing culture is one where people have really difficult conversations. There's tension and people can hold that tension respectfully as opposed to trying to get rid of the tension really quickly, where we have difficult meetings as opposed to super easy, lovely meetings where everyone thinks the same and everyone, agrees immediately. They're not good measures of culture, but they're often the things that we do measure to see if our culture is good. And there is a ton of, nowadays engagement surveys. There is a ton of online resources. You can do an engagement survey super cheaply, super easily. You don't need, if you're a small company, you don't need to sign up to one of these companies going to benchmark you about around 1,000 organizations. It's not necessary at the point that you are on the journey. You can go online and download an engagement survey and do it super quickly, but you have to create the safety where people feel that they can be honest. Otherwise, it's all a pointless exercise.
You so made me smile there when you talked about family, because I have so many interesting conversations with organisations who say, "Oh, Royston, we've got a really nice family culture," and I'm absolutely on the same page as you. You can have a performance culture, adult to adult, and a family. And for me, I'm at the other end of the spectrum. That a business is a performance environment where you have grown-up conversations, and you might have to have difficult developmental conversations, but also, hopefully, you're having plenty of inspirational conversations because people are performing and you're catching them doing it right as well. So
Yeah, exactly.
I'm totally on the same page. And I think people got to be really careful when they talk about, that word family, because there's so many different connotations that throws up, and so many negative connotations about family when you're talking about that within a corporate environment. And I love your point. This is great, Claire, because it's the practical stuff that I try to add value with on the podcast. And your point there, you could just go out and ask a simple question, couldn't you? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being we've got the best culture ever, where would you rate our culture? And 2 questions that precede that is, number 1, why did you score yourself where we did? What do you like and what don't you like about the culture? Even as a crude, as simple as that would give you some insight, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and what you were just saying really made me think. What often people do is they wait till there's a problem before they start looking. So, for example, exit surveys. For me, fundamentally flawed. At the point that somebody's leaving, people are our biggest and most expensive asset. And so you don't want to wait till somebody leaves to ask them why. But also at the point that someone's leaving, psychologically their engagement is not there. They don't trust you. They don't want to be there. So why would they tell you? They're either just going to tell you nothing, or they're going to make it up. Because they're worried, perhaps, particularly in small sectors, that they're going to have to engage with you at some point. And so, there's a fakeness around that. Or they're not in a space where they can reflect. So rather than doing exit surveys, when you're doing your appraisals, when you're doing your one-to-one conversations, have a stay interview, which are questions like, what is it you love about here? So rather than thinking about what's the problem with the culture, think about what are the great things about the culture. What really helps us be our best? When are the moments when you feel really engaged by work and you want to do more? What's your aspiration? What's the thing that drives you mad that you wish you could change? And if you have those in regular conversation, it tells you about the culture in a way probably more than any of the wider research would.
No, what did you call that, Claire? A stay conversation?
Interview, yeah.
Stay interview. I love the concept of that. And it links to what you talked earlier about how do you stop the flow further upstream? Because if you're having a conversation at an exit point, somebody's left, and the question is, if you'd have had a stay interview and done further work upstream, it might not be that individual was wrong for the organisation. It's that we haven't unlocked their potential by creating the culture where they could flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that a lot. A lot of organizations say we want difference. We want people who are going to challenge our culture. And they actually genuinely want that, but they haven't set themselves up to be prepared for it. So when somebody comes in and they do challenge the culture, I think I was talking in the DIN session around, and it's got an intergenerational lens, but it absolutely doesn't have to. A Gen Z person coming into a very hierarchical part of a business and listening to the CEO's speech, and then because the CEO said, I want you to tell me, I want you to be part of this, if we're all in this together, sent an email to the CEO saying, I wanted to give you some feedback on your speech. Here are the things I think that didn't land very well. I wasn't sure I agree with this. Well, of course, the reaction from that was huge. Who is this person? Get them out of here. How dare they? But what they're doing is actually doing exactly what you've asked them to do, just not in the way you wanted them to do it. So sometimes we need to be really honest with ourselves. Do we actually want disruption, or do we not?
Yes.
And neither's right nor wrong. It's just a moment in time and a decision for your business. But if we do want that, how do we enable it? How do we empower it so that when it comes and it's uncomfortable, the culture doesn't kick it out, which is what we often see.
So my summary from that 10-minute conversation, which I think was just so golden, is culture is everything. And make sure that you are investing the time to really be intentional about the culture that you have and want in your organization, so that when you recruit, you can recruit into an environment that's going to allow people to flourish and not fail.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm conscious of time, and honestly, Claire, I could talk to you for hours, because you fascinate me just in terms of your knowledge and your experience. And what I love is the practical examples, because you've been there, done it with the organisations that you're working with. One final question: what trends do you see emerging in the field of diversity and inclusion in the next few years? What's coming down the pipe?
So I see some really positive trends and a few worrying ones. The really positive ones are, like I said before, I think we've gone through a period where people wanted to fix this. We had the murder of George Floyd. We had, the Sarah Everard case in the UK, particularly, various other things around the world, where people were like, oh, diversity, this is a real big problem. And they put a lot of time and money into what I would call performative stuff like how many of us joined the gym on the 1st of January. It makes us feel good. We can post it on social media, but it doesn't really bring any change. So they did a lot of stuff that kind of showed a great lot of action, but wasn't really addressing the problem that we've got. That's why I hate mentorship as a concept. All the research will tell us that underrepresented groups are over mentored and under sponsored, but the easy thing to do is mentor people. The easy thing to go is go and talk to school kids about your sector. Doesn't change the immediate problem. So we had a lot of that stuff, and of course what it didn't do was bring any change. And so what I think we're seeing now is a higher expectation of return on investment. So when people are putting money into this space, they want to see the impactful outcomes. And there are lots of great practice. There are lots of things that do bring outcomes. They're just not the easy things to do that perhaps people might want to do. I used to get it all the time. I used to get companies ring me up and say, can you do a keynote or a session on inclusion? I was like, what is it you're trying to achieve? We just want a keynote on inclusion. It's like, unless you can tell me what the problem is and what it is you're trying to achieve, because it doesn't always need to be a problem, then this isn't going to have any impact. So we're seeing that shift towards less of the sexy optic stuff and more of the unsexy stuff, like the data and the talent management and the unpicking the barriers and the embedding into systems that will bring the results, but doesn't look great on a report, doesn't look as great. And I think we're seeing that, which is a great thing and is much needed, I think. The second thing we're seeing is people beginning to see this as moving away from a fluffy people thing that's standalone, that we add on to the end of every sentence and that normally lives in HR, to embedding it into the way that we do things and seeing it as part of the wider culture. The amount of organizations that I talk to who see culture and inclusion as two entirely separate things, and then probably ethics and governance as another entirely separate thing. They're all facets of the same thing. So we're seeing it more embedding into process rather than add on. So they're the great things we're seeing. I think the other thing we're seeing is a move towards thinking about inclusion rather than diversity. So we've had a space of, almost doing things where you've led people to go, oh, this is what we do for the Black people. This is what we do for the LGBT people. This is what we do for the disabled people. This is what we do for social mobility. And of course, as time poor leaders, it's like, oh my God, which one am I doing? And what do I do when I find that most people are actually intersectional, and some of the barriers are very intersectional between those things. So now which one do I do? And instead that real focus on inclusion and removing the barriers at source, but recognizing that some of those barriers are really consistent across all of those groups. So it's not about how many different types of people have I got, but have I got that? If we practice inclusion, then diversity will naturally come as a result of that.
And Claire, sorry just to pause you there. That's such a insightful observation, because I talk all the time with clients about language is everything. And actually, I can see that, because diversity equals potential silos in your thinking, whereas inclusion equals, are we one high performance team? And I can see how if you get inclusion right, then diversity is naturally the bedfellow and the output of getting your inclusive strategy right and the inclusive culture.
Yeah, and what we've seen over years is, that silo function leads to almost picking groups against each other, and we've definitely seen that. All the research will tell you that when women on boards was a high-profile regulatory thing, it still is, but I would argue it doesn't have the profile anymore. Women on boards went up in a very rudimentary. What you saw was people adding things into boards, or a very small group of women being on 7 or 8 different boards to make the numbers up. But ethnicity on boards went down at the same time, because people are like, I've got my women on boards, tick, job done. And also within organizations, that concept of inclusion is a pie. When you're talking about limited resources, when you're talking about limited time, it's like, who's the most oppressed? Therefore, who are we going to spend time on? And that becomes a problem later down the line, because, of course, you create that inequality in your systems. The second, I think some of the more worrying things we're seeing is this, some of the rhetoric that's available on social media and things, and actually in some very what I would have historically called reputable organizations who are kind of doing this go woke and go broke, whereas all the research tells you that isn't true. But putting a lot of pressure on organizations to suggest that this kind of stuff is stuff that they shouldn't be engaging in. And actually, if we change the word woke means awareness to other people's lived experience that might not be the same as yours. So, why that suddenly has become a bad thing, who knows? But we're definitely seeing people nervous in this space, rather than seeing it as what I think the business imperative that it 100% is, not only for the internal business, but equally for engaging clients. If you are client facing, we know at the moment about 75% of people make purchase decisions on how they perceive an organization, and whether they perceive an organization is ethical and socially aware and all of that. And that's only getting stronger through the younger generations. Gen A, the generation that are about 12 years old now, because of the environment they've grown up in, they are hugely knowledgeable, critical, and influenced by social impact. So if you're not getting it right now, you're never going to reach them. So we're seeing that. And then the other thing I think we're seeing is a dilution of what we're focusing on. So a lot of organizations, they say inclusion, they actually mean gender. They actually mean the things that they are measured by. And that for me becomes really worrying, because they're the things that someone somewhere has decided are important enough to put government time into. And actually there's a whole raft of things underneath. Social mobility being one. I hate the term social mobility. I think it's a really patronizing term. That's a different conversation. But, it's not a protected characteristic by law. Certainly in the UK, it's not, therefore, in any indices or government things. I think it's the intersection between social mobility and ethnicity and cultural heritage and disability and women and all of those is huge, and yet we're not focusing on it. So I think we're seeing spikes in interest based on what someone somewhere thinks is a good idea.
Wow, so much to think about. Claire, it's been, honestly, I think I could continue this conversation. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 at some point. Claire, if people wanted to make contact with you to understand more about what you do and the services and the value that you can add, where can they get hold of you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Claire Harvey Anata, pretty easy to find. I don't really do much else, and I cannot stand what was Twitter. I don't know what we call it nowadays, or any of those things. I think yeah, those kind of things. But LinkedIn is probably my main place, or just reach out. You've got my contact details. I think I'm quite easy to find, but I'm really happy to have conversations.
No, brilliant. And I'd like to, I hope we will be doing more together. So my final summary for our listeners is, are you building an inclusive culture where people feel like their voices can be heard, where they are prepared to speak up, and an environment where they can flourish as one high performance team? And notice we didn't talk about the word family in there. So Claire, thank you. Really, really great session. I'm sure there is value and golden nuggets that our listeners will be able to take. As always, the Life of the Business Leader podcast, we like to bring you practical sessions and real world ideas that you'll instantly be able to take back and apply to your business. So if you like it, make sure that you share this episode. And from me, a final thank you, Claire, for coming on today. You were brilliant. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me.